Hello, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Leah Holland with Fight for the Future. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm based in Portland, Oregon in the US. And I have to say, I've been looking forward to this event for months, ever since Michael had the idea. We're at an important inflection point in terms of human rights online, because growing awareness of harm combined with new technology equals change. Change can be good or bad, and activists could steer what Web3, the metaverse, blockchain, decentralization, disintermediation, or whatever you call this host of emerging technologies will be. Just look at the major successes of the climate justice movement with cryptocurrencies. Many see the metaverse as different from Web3, and some wonder if decentralization might actually be best achieved via blockchain at all. But what's essential is that we talk about it, because we cannot fight bad technology or champion systems that promote human rights if we don't learn. This is a time where human rights activists need to ensure that our language and efforts aren't being co-opted by technology projects we haven't invested in understanding. We must ensure that technologies and policies that claim to serve the causes we've been struggling for so long actually serve to advance them. Privacy, equity, consent, accessibility, stopping big tech. Can we build better tools to combat the problems technology is currently causing? Or are all the hype and scams just making our work more difficult? I'm grateful to be talking about it with the wonderful group we've assembled today. And I'm going to pass it over to Michael now for his thoughts as we get started.
It's a pleasure to co-host and organize this webinar on Web3 and the Metaverse with Leah and Fight for the Future. And thank you all so much for joining. My name is Michael Kleinman, and I'm the Director of Technology and Human Rights for Amnesty International USA. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm based in California. To build for just a moment on what Leah said, over the last decade, from the Arab Spring to January 6th, we've seen our understanding of the values and harms of social media evolve significantly. It's critical that we think deeply about the benefits and drawbacks of new technology at an early stage. Not that we can predict what the future holds, but this kind of deep thinking helps us understand both how to steer new technologies in a positive direction and at least conceptualize how they might be problematic and what we should do about it. In hindsight, I wish we thought more deeply about the potential benefits and drawbacks of social media a decade ago. Now is the time to have these kinds of conversations about Web3 and the metaverse. A quick semantic note. The terms themselves, metaverse, Web3, are fluid. This causes quite a bit of confusion, but I think that confusion comes from thinking that these terms are more descriptive than they are. It's useful perhaps to think of these terms as analogous, as someone once said, to the way that people used the term information superhighway in the late 1990s. Information superhighway wasn't an accurate description of what the web became, but it captured the zeitgeist. It was a term that recognized and tried to name the feeling that something significant was afoot. I think the same is true of terms like metaverse and Web3. This webinar will be 1 hour and will be the first of a monthly series of webinars looking at this topic. For today, we will ask each of our 4 speakers to present for 3 to 5 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A based on questions that attendees have submitted. With that, I'd love to introduce and to thank today's speakers. We have Wendy Hanamura of DWeb and Director of Partnerships at the Internet Archive. We have John Callis, Director of Technology Projects at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We have Jennifer Brody, U.S. Advocacy Manager at Access Now. And we have Sarah Roth-Gaudet, Executive Director of Fight for the Future. Again, thank you all so much. And with that, I pass it over to Wendy.
Thank you so much. My name is Wendy Hanamura, and I'm the Director of Partnerships at the Internet Archive, a huge nonprofit digital library. And I am so grateful to be talking to you because the decentralized web has been a part of my life for the last 6 years. It's something I care about very much. I thought it might be helpful for us to start by kind of doing a Decentralized Web 101, an introduction, to lay down some common vocabulary and some common definitions. So let's start with the basics. Centralized versus decentralized. A centralized network is controlled by a central authority. It can be a person, it can be a company, it can be a government, but that authority has to maintain the code. It has to run the servers. It protects and keeps the data. Most of the internet that we use today is run by these central authorities. And you have to trust that the central authority is going to do what's in your best interest. Now look at the right-hand side of the screen, distributed networks. Now, distributed networks work across a bunch of different nodes, and they're interconnected, communicating toward one common goal. In a classic example, computation or data can be distributed across all these different nodes, but one node can still control all of them. And in the center, you have decentralized networks. It's just like the distributed network, except for one thing. The difference is that in a decentralized network, no node can tell all the other ones what to do. You have a peer-to-peer network with no controlling authority. Some classic examples: Facebook, your classic centralized network with an all-powerful company in the center. Amazon Cloud is a distributed network where computation and data are distributed across all the nodes of the Amazon Cloud, but ultimately Amazon controls them. And finally, a decentralized protocol or network, IPFS, the Interplanetary File System. Now, this distributes data across many nodes, but the creator of this protocol, Protocol Labs, doesn't control the work being done or where the data is stored. So let's talk about Web 3.0. But I think to understand that, we have to start a little bit earlier with Web 1.0. That is what we classically call Tim Berners-Lee's invention, the World Wide Web. Web 1.0 started in about 1991, and it allowed everyone to become a publisher. It was quite democratic in nature. It was quite decentralized. Typically, a user would create a self-hosted website, and it would be, hyperlinked texts and files and applications that you could read. Maybe you could download them, but these were pages that were static. So that's why some people call Web 1.0 the read-only web. Then get to about 2000, and you have what we have been calling Web 2.0. Now that's the web that we use today. You start to see the emergence of these big platforms like Facebook and Twitter, and they allow people to interact with the content, to comment on it, to share it. That's why we call this Web 2.0 the read-write web, or some people call it the social web. This also, though, has meant that large centralized platforms take control over what kind of information we access, our privacy, our security. We've given up ease of use and interactivity for control. Finally, maybe around 2010, you start to see Web 3.0 emerge. It starts to emerge around the same time as the Bitcoin blockchain. The central innovation of what we're calling Web 3.0 is that these technologies are verifiable. Some would say it's a trustless system, because instead of trusting Facebook to control the data, you're trusting the data being on the blockchain itself, and the blockchain verifies it. Some people are also lumping in the metaverse and AI into this concept of Web 3.0. But there is a lot of debate about what Web 3 actually is. Someone I respect quite a lot, Jay Graber, who now leads the Twitter's Blue Sky project and was herself first an activist. Her point is that Web 3 is more than just blockchains. And I want you to remember that. She says that Web 3, the key is it has to be self-certifying. That means you're using these cryptographic IDs for your ID, and you have data that has these immutable hashes. And her point is that Web 3 includes blockchains, but it also includes many protocols that are not blockchains. things like IPFS and Hypercore and Secure Scuttlebutt or SSB. Now, Hypercore and SSB are governed by nonprofits and co-ops. They are not big companies. So if that's Web 3.0, what is the decentralized web that I'm always talking about? Okay, think about the web as like a stack of technologies. What if you could decentralize every level of the stack? Storage could be decentralized, the transport layer. You'd have applications with backends that were decentralized. Identity, self-sovereign identity, you could hold on to your own identity information instead of having it live in Facebook or Google or whatever you use to authorize on. Payments could be decentralized. Instead of using a credit card or PayPal, you could make small micropayments directly to creators. Some say that even governance could be decentralized through things called DAOs, where you have either automated or user-generated decision-making. I think what I want to share with you all is that I have been working on this thing called the decentralized web with a whole global community of people. And last year, we created the decentralized or DWeb principles. These are principles like human agency and mutual respect, distributed benefits, ecological imperatives, putting power in the hands of people. These are the North Stars of our movement. And it's so early in this Web3 world. We still have time to take control, to demand the values that we care about. You can write privacy, openness, mutual benefit right into the code. And that is the work that the DWeb has been doing. And that's what we're working towards. Thanks.
Wendy, thank you so much. That was phenomenal. And I'd like to pass it along to John.
Hi, I'm John Callis. I'm Director of Technology Projects at EFF. And decentralized web is what I think we really ought to be calling it. That I think Michael had it right, that Web3 is like information superhighway. It is an attempt to describe what is happening that we probably should get rid of really quickly, because very few of these technologies are actually about the web. And there are also a lot of decentralized technologies that are in fact not blockchain based or anything like that. In addition to things like IPFS, which is one of the fundamental things that is extraordinarily important. There are non-blockchain at all technologies like Mastodon, like Matrix, which are Mastodon is a distributed Twitter-like system for doing microblogging. Matrix is a way to do secure messaging that does not require a central provider. There are other systems that provide things that we are doing that don't require a central place to do it. And we also need to look at these technologies to try to figure out how we keep them from being re-centralized. The basic web that we have is perhaps the most decentralized technology that anybody has come up with. There are a few others that are equally as good, like email, the way that we do it now. These are all utterly decentralized. Anybody in the world can go get a $15 computer, bring it up, and you have web servers, you have email, you have all of these other services, and no one can stop you from doing it. However, these all centralized, and they centralized for a whole lot of reasons that we could spend an entire day talking about. But in some respects, they centralized because lots of us got tired of running it ourselves. And just like lots of us want to call in a plumber, we want to call in an electrician, we want to take our car to a mechanic who knows more about what they're doing than we do. Most of us want to be in a situation where we aren't our own site reliability engineer. It really only takes a couple of Sundays spoiled because your email went down and you have to fix it before you say, maybe I should get someone else to do this. And this is one of the things that drove things. And that's why the technology itself is not going to be something that that keeps this new promise that is there for us from turning into same old, and we re-centralize yet again. That manage and run them need to be looking at how to be decentralized themselves. So we have a core suite of technologies, but we also need to be looking at how the human beings control the technologies, not the technologies controlling ourselves. Otherwise, natural tendencies will in fact re-centralize things.
John, thank you. That was terrific. And on that note, I'd love to pass it over to Jennifer of Access Now.
Great. Thanks so much for having me here today and for organizing Fight for the Future and Amnesty International. It's a great conversation to be a part of. So the metaverse, I will be focusing my comments on explicitly the metaverse. So the term is vague. There's a lot of hype. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, as was mentioned at the beginning of this session. Nevertheless, the intention it's getting is a great opportunity for us to talk about ensuring that human rights are protected and even extended in augmented reality, AR, and virtual reality, VR, key to any vision of the metaverse. So in order to avoid constantly saying AR and VR, we can use the acronym XR, extended reality, as a shorthand to refer to these two technologies. So like any other piece of technology, XR can have many positive impacts on our daily lives. It can be a useful tool in areas like medicine, science, and education. Even artists are using XR creatively to make virtual worlds their canvas and create new forms of expression. Protests and social movements have also used these technologies to raise awareness on collective issues or to make their voice heard when it is physically impossible or dangerous to do so. However, XR also poses substantial risks to human rights. So, right, the elephant in the room, the big risk is surveillance and its privacy implications. So virtual reality headsets and AR glasses coupled with other wearables such as the Apple Watch, which I see more and more, could continue the march towards ever more invasive data collection and ubiquitous surveillance. This data harvesting, often by companies with a history of putting profit before protections, sets the stage for unprecedented invasions into our lives and even our thoughts, as data collected by XR devices is used for targeted advertising and to make inferences about our deepest desires and darkest fears. So essentially psychologically profiling us using biometrics and other pieces of data. And then what happens to the data, right? Once collected, there's little users can do to mitigate the harms done by leaks or data being monetized by third parties, right? Especially considering if we're thinking of the context in the United States, there is no federal data protection law. So some questions to think about after the information is collected: will it be sent to the cloud? Will it be encrypted? Will it be shared with third parties or used to make inferences about us, which could then be used to target ads? Do we have any transparency into how our data will be handled or processed? And are we given an opportunity to exert valid consent? And then related to this topic of surveillance and privacy protections, a risk that stems from this is online harassment and abuse. This can happen with AR glasses, right? So there's many examples. I'm sure you've heard Google glasses, perhaps you've heard of Snapchat spectacles, Facebook's Ray-Ban smart glasses. So these devices, a person can be wearing them, right, walking down the street and easily record their surroundings in secret, unbeknownst to the bystander. Future iterations of AR glasses could even leverage facial recognition software to identify people in public spaces, which could enable stalking, or hypothetically use deep fake style software to virtually remove the clothes of a passerby, which is obviously frightening and deeply concerning. So while the public may be watching out for these threats from, Big Brother, right, the big tech companies, they may be overlooking the capacity of AR glasses to make everyday citizens little brothers. So in thinking about the potential for online harassment and abuse, right, there's a lot of questions to consider if we just kind of sit here and spitball about potential scenarios. One, will far-right groups use AR to label the houses of immigrants on virtual maps? You know, potentially could school bullies use AR to place offensive objects outside of a victim's house to taunt the victim, right? There's many scary scenarios we need to consider. Finally, another risk to consider relates to the mapping of public spaces. So we should be asking today, here now at this talk, whether we are comfortable having Facebook and other companies turn user-generated data about public spaces into a commodity. It also raises the prospect of inequality reinforced by geography, where wealthy areas have better AR maps than under-resourced neighborhoods, cities, or towns, because people in these wealthy areas are more highly valued customers. So again, a number of questions to consider. If the data Facebook uses are crowdsourced, shouldn't the information be a public resource? And who should control the AR map of a city, the city itself or a private company trying to make a profit? And finally, what happens to the people who are excluded from these digital worlds, right? We need to be certain we're not, recreating systems of discrimination and exclusion. And with that, I will end. Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you so much. And last, but certainly not least, to bring us home, Sarah.
Great. Wow, thanks, Jennifer. A lot of questions and a lot of things to think about. I'm going to share a bit about what's happening now. How is civil society engaging, and in particular, what's happening in the US. But before I do, I'll just say, for Fight for the Future, we were founded in 2011. We got started through fights like stopping internet censorship bills, SOPA and PIPA, passing net neutrality, all in an effort to help preserve the open and decentralized nature of the early internet. We've spent recent years in the trenches of surveillance capitalism, leading fights to ban law enforcement use of facial recognition or working to dismantle Amazon's surveillance empire. So for us, these issues are just a natural extension of these fights and fit squarely in our mission to ensure that technology is a force for empowerment and free expression rather than corruption and inequality. But I think we can probably all agree that whether we like it or not, these technologies and the entities that have grown up around them are a major force, a $1 trillion industry, give or take, depending on the day. And it's imperative that civil society and especially human rights organizations, their members and activists do their own analysis and create much needed accountability for the space. But so to get back to the lay of the land on how civil society is engaging, I'll cover kind of three main through lines that I've seen. The first is that organizations like Fight for the Future and EFF are playing defense against some bad regulation. So started with in terms of our engagement with FinCEN and the Treasury here in the US, writing new rules that will dramatically increase warrantless surveillance of financial transactions, including cryptocurrencies. Along with Coin Center and others, we helped to facilitate more than 4,000 people submitting comments opposing these rules. This push from the Treasury for greater surveillance culminated in several last-minute additions to Biden's infrastructure bill, which were intended to be sort of pay-fors to fund the bill through tax collection on cryptocurrencies. Obviously, this is not in and of itself a problem, but it was clearly written hastily and without a deep understanding of how the technology works. For example, it expanded the definition of a traditional financial broker in a way that would sweep up software developers working on blockchain projects, many of them volunteers, requiring them to report information on transactions on the blockchain that they don't even have access to. Another provision would make failure to report on these transactions a felony. So we helped to facilitate a massive backlash with more than 40,000 calls going into the Senate and a last-minute amendment from Senator Wyden that ultimately failed, but I think has laid the groundwork for how this could be fixed in future legislation. And while the infrastructure bill ultimately passed, we'll continue to fight for the regulations to be narrowed or eliminated, and we'll leverage the backlash to spark a conversation about what thoughtful, human rights-centered regulations could look like. For example, this can and should be explored through a consumer protection lens as well. The second through line is that the first coalition of human rights organizations engaging with decentralized tech that I know of is forming. We helped to put together a letter along with 26 other organizations that we've worked with around many freedom of expression issues, including end-to-end encryption, defending Section 230, and financial deplatforming. It includes racial justice organizations, immigrant and indigenous rights groups, sex worker advocates, and the letter includes a list of principles not unlike the ones that Wendy shared, that our lawmakers and regulators should consider to center the needs of marginalized people, ensuring privacy, protecting the rights of software developers to write code, ensuring that regulation doesn't further entrench the bigger companies, and more. And then the third sort of through line I'll mention that Leah referred to as well is that climate activists are bringing important accountability to the space. The focus is sparking the popularity of low carbon blockchains, driving companies to make carbon neutrality commitments. The Ethereum blockchain, which supports the second biggest cryptocurrency, is planning to shift their consensus mechanism from proof of work to proof of stake, which uses considerably less energy. There was also a congressional hearing on energy use last week, and we think that's great. We'd like to see a similar hearing on human rights. And in terms of what's next, I mentioned this briefly already, but continuing to just push back against bad, poorly written regulation that could criminalize developers or kill off some of the most important privacy-focused elements of the technology. If lawmakers are only looking at this through a financial lens, they're missing the big picture. So it's hard to overstate the importance of there being someone, and ideally many someones in the room advocating for human rights. Continuing to build the coalition so that we can share our analysis and come together around key fights. And lastly, we'll be working to just create more of these types of opportunities for human rights groups and activists to learn about and engage with these technologies as we move forward. That's me.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for that run through. This has been such a good orientation to these issues. And I'm thrilled to see that we still have a half an hour left. So let's go ahead and transition to the Q&A. Let's begin with a question that we got from someone who registered. We anonymized these because we didn't ask permission for names. So what safeguards are being put in place to secure human freedoms and mitigate corporate influences in Web3 and the metaverse? And I will amend that question with if any. And I think that whoever would like to answer, this is definitely a general question. Go for it, Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Just to kick this conversation off, would just state that, like, in the current world in which we live, we are lacking many human rights protections, whether that be if you're thinking about, content moderation online, right, or data protection. Again, there's no federal data protection law in the US. So we don't want to put the cart before the horse. Like today in the world we're currently living, we're lacking so many protections, right? So in the metaverse or Web3, right, unlikely if we can't kind of address the issues today, I would say.
So I'd like to weigh in a little bit. I think it's the worst of times and it's the best of times, and it's very, very early, right? So in the worst of times, you have Microsoft, the largest corporation in the world, they love to say that, poised to launch self-sovereign identity, decentralized identity across 1 billion Microsoft users. They could swamp the field and kind of own that process. So there is very little we could do to prevent the monetization and the dominance of billion-dollar corporations. However, in the best of times, right, when you look at these decentralized technologies, they have something different from the Web 2 technologies, and that's that they are all open source. For whatever reason, as these young companies got going, they understood that they needed the developers out there to start to adopt them. You have to understand, when we started this in 2015, it was just notional. There was no code, there was no community. So all of these core things, Ethereum, Protocol Labs, SSB, they're all open source. That means that you could have what they like to call governance by forking. If I am pissed off at Protocol Labs, there's nothing to stop me from taking that code, forking it, and doing something else with it. So you have seen these Web3 or decentralized web companies bend over backwards to try and create more democratic governance. They have board boards that are separate and B Corps, all sorts of things. They all have foundations to try and control some of the big decision making. So, that's something quite new and promising.
Terrific, and thank you guys so much. And quickly to jump to a question that has been raised in the chat and the Q&A. Should we even call most Web3 technology decentralized? The truth is that most consumers and individuals interact with Web3 systems through highly centralized intermediary platforms. This was brought up, for instance, recently in an article by Moxie Marlinspike, and a link to that is in the chat. Further, as another attendee said, just sort of building on this, are we going to be able to avoid using centralized platforms to access blockchain, et cetera, as most people will not have the skills or desire to access these servers directly? And so to throw it to our panelists, what do you think? Is it accurate to call Web3 decentralized? What are the advantages and disadvantages of that terminology? And then what is the truth behind the hype?
I'll take some. This is a problem that we have right now, that many of these systems are decentralized in architecture. They're decentralized in theory, but they're not decentralized in either implementation or how they're organized. For example, 90% of all of the Bitcoins are controlled by 10% of the miners. There's a inequity in there that mimics almost exactly the US stock market. On the Ethereum and the top 5 mining pools control nearly 2/3 of what's going on. And this is a problem, because what we're moving from is a world in which the dominant players are people that we can name, to ones in which the dominant players will be people that we can't name. And so we need to have governance behind things that makes sure that we don't have, for example, the usual gang of financial services companies managing all of these things. We want to make sure that we don't build something that is utterly cool like IPFS and then have essentially almost all of the storage being controlled by Microsoft and Amazon. Just like today, like I said, that email is an incredibly decentralized technology, but in the United States, probably 2/3 of all email is either Google or Microsoft, probably 1/3 for everything else. Worldwide, the top 20 providers probably govern 90% of all worldwide email. And these technologies themselves do not prevent these systems from coalescing and becoming things that are bottlenecked just because of the natural forces of growth and technology.
Thanks, John. And does anyone else want to jump in and talk about sort of the decentralized versus centralized nature of Web3?
Look, I think we're in a very transitional period. Most people can't get on the DWeb easily. So you have to have browsers like Brave and intermediary bridges into the DWeb. But I think this is just a temporary phase. And, right now you can use Brave and you can see a website on the decentralized web, or you can see it on the World Wide Web. Pretty soon, all of that will be pervasive, I'd say.
And I would just chime in on my soapbox that these sort of questions and that sort of accountability, and for example, that article, Moxie's article that was previously mentioned, are exactly the sort of input and accountability that is needed from human rights activists and from those of us who've been engaging with technologies and platforms and services that under-deliver on their promises, to say the least. And so, yeah, I look forward to continuing to be and grow the force for accountability in the space with great people like all of you. So I think that we should definitely ask a question around climate. We've gotten several in terms of Web3 or the metaverse providing realistic sustainability wins, or the particular harms of Bitcoin mining with their energy-intensive proof of work, for example. I'd love to hear a bit about how panelists are thinking about climate when it comes to this suite of technologies and the fantastic work that's been done so far in terms of making this a front and center issue for these technologies in general.
Well, I'll leap in. There's nothing inherently energy sucking about the metaverse. So let's just push that aside. I think when you're talking about the sustainability of the planet, you're really talking about blockchains. All right. So once again, I want to point out that Web3, however you define it, is much larger than just blockchains, and that not all blockchains are created equal. That's what you've heard people talking about. Proof of stake, that's the Bitcoin blockchain, highly intensively using of energy. But there are other blockchains that people are using, even for NFTs, that are not as bad. So it's such a nuanced conversation. And when people start to cancel Web3 because they don't like blockchains, they don't like NFTs, I think you really have to start peeling back the nuances of the technology, or else you're going to throw out a lot of really good things that do not use energy intensive blockchains along with the bathwater.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say we need a panel like this with climate organizations, and I think need to be, and at Fight for the Future, and Leah's doing a lot of outreach and looking to meet with and to engage with climate organizations. That there's, I think, an excellent opportunity, as with most things, for sort of intersectional work here, as we are fighting for both, human rights and, of course, safeguarding against climate, disaster is a key piece of that equation.
So I'll jump in as well. We've known ever since there was proof of work and it was first proposed that it doesn't work. Adam Clayton and Ben Laurie came out with a great paper that was proof of work proves not to work. It continues to prove not to work, that it's absolutely horrible, that it is basically burning electricity for not a clear use at all. And even systems that are wastefully burning electricity in smaller quantities are still wastefully burning electricity. Other proof of resource for other resources are similarly dangerous. There are ways to get to something that would work well, but for example, the Chia coin that was using proof of storage caused a run on disk drives as people went and bought up disk drives so that they could make money by creating tied up, destroyed disk drives that would be e-waste and whatever. Proof of stake is somewhat better. I think that proof of stake also has the advantage that it's at least honest, which is that proof of stake boils down to the golden rule, in that those who have the gold make the rules. And at least it's direct with proof of stake. It's indirect with many of these other ones, because it is big actors who will buy the proof resources and thus control things that way. We need to have ways that consensus does, that doesn't have any of these things that implicitly cause a runaway of desires because people can make money at it.
Terrific. And I'd actually like to tee up a question for Jennifer very quickly, which is, what safeguards do you see being put in place now that you think are really strong building blocks in terms of protecting basic rights in the metaverse? And then building on that, what is your ideal version of what the metaverse or a decentralized web would look like? What should we be building towards? And then I'd love to hear other panelists' thoughts as well.
Sure. So the statement that I just shared in the chat walks through the type of metaverse we aspire to. It's a joint Access Now EFF statement. So a few highlights. What I've mentioned is we need governments to enact or update data protection legislation for human rights to be protected in this new virtual world. These laws need to be enforced. We need to safeguard the diversity of metaverse platforms, right? So the Facebook, Amazons, Apples of the world, right, do not have a monopoly over these forms of technology. What else? As in real life, governments need to refrain from censoring free expression, right, in line with the Santa Clara principles. So a lot of, right, like metaverse aside, a lot of what we're fighting for, like today, like in the world we're living in right now, applies in the metaverse as well. And then there's obviously a corporate responsibility component, right? We need companies to publicly pledge to require governments to get the necessary legal process to access extended reality data, et cetera. So we need investors to step up and evaluate their portfolios to determine where they may be investing in these, right, potentially nefarious technologies, right, and to leverage their influence. And then, right, digital rights activists have a role to play, right, to make our demands heard, right? So Access Now, we sent a letter to Nintendo about their new Mario Kart virtual reality game that in order to play it, it maps your living room, right? So there's a lot of potential privacy implications there. Like we don't know who has access to the data, et cetera. So yeah, those are some snippets of what we would like to see.
Great snippets. Let's see. So I think that it would be good to ask some questions from students. We've gotten a couple of questions about the implications of Web3 in the metaverse for colleges and universities specifically, and what sort of actions or opportunities are available for students to get involved. I feel like, Wendy, this might be your cup of tea.
Well, that's a good question. I can drop a link in from a recent workshop that was the focus, higher ed and the metaverse and Web3. But when you think about knowledge institutions like the Internet Archive, what are our big problems? One of them is that as you have a library that expands exponentially, how do you store all that stuff? Where do you store it? How do you store it so that everyone can get it, whether they're behind the Chinese firewall or in front of the Chinese firewall? And to a certain extent, decentralized storage starts to perhaps address that for universities and libraries. It might be cheaper. It might be hard to censor. It's definitely replicable. If your library servers go down, it's scattered across many servers around the globe. So I think there's much in the decentralized storage world that could be applicable. The other thing I wanted to tell you this little story about Jay Graber, who is now the head of Twitter's Blue Sky project. When I met Jay, she was leading a coalition for free press around net neutrality. She came to our first event in 2016, the first decentralized web conference, just as an attendee. And she told me there she met her boss, her life partner, and her new career. She went to coding school at that point. I mean, this was a political activist who went to coding school. She went on to get a job with Zcash, and then now she leads one of the most important initiatives to decentralize social media out there. You can go in 6 years from activist to leader, because this is such a new and fertile ground. So, you know, if I were a student and I really wanted to get into this, I would start learning the policies, the regulations, the coding, because it is wide open still.
And I'm going to try and pull together, thank you, Wendy. I'm going to try and pull together a few questions from the chat and the Q&A that we've gotten ahead of time. But I'm really curious what the panelists think about, what does community organizing look like on Web3? I mean, is that a nonsensical question? Is that Mad Libs? Or do you think that entities like distributed autonomous organizations and others offer new ways for groups to cohere and organize and plan?
I mean, I'll hop in for a second to give folks more time to think on this one. I have found the concept of distributed autonomous organizations, or DAOs, to be completely fascinating. The concept of tools that enable more distributed management, more sharing of resources, just more democratization of how organizations are run and what decisions are made and who's doing what, and ways to programmatically compensate volunteers to actually employ them, and the efforts of the organization are all very cool. I have not been at a level where I've actually seen them work. Just by the nature of how overwhelming it is to be an activist who's interfacing with these technologies. So I think that the potential there and the conversations that are being had about how corporations and organizations are currently organized and top-down structure and what its limitations are fascinating and important. And I think that it's cool that technology is prompting these conversations, but any of these tools, again, is only as good as the people who use and maintain them. So I would hesitate to be prescriptive in terms of, you know, DAO will save us or what have you. And John, I see that you're unmuted. Do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I was going to say it's very interesting technology, and I think that part of the reason why you saw so much silence among us is, in fact, I'm still not really understanding exactly how a DAO is better than existing organizations and the way that we put together things already. There are certainly places where the tools that are there could work and could make things be good, but there are a whole bunch of bumps along the way. And as someone who got started with a lot of these things, building communities and augmented realities 30 years ago, this is how I got into encryption and other things. Building the technology does not create the human structures. When you talk about it from, I'm an activist, how would I do this? This is like saying, I'm an activist, how do ballpoint pens help me? And they will help you, they really will, but you are not going to come into a new form of activism and creating political change because a new technology came. It's going to be how you use it and how it supports your mission. And you need to look at it from what the mission is and how the tool supports the mission, not here's a new tool, what can we do with it? And that's part of how you misappropriate things with technologies, that you say, this is a really cool shiny hammer, what can I hit with it? Not, here's the problem that we have, would a hammer be useful for this?
I want to agree with John that, you know, I've been in this world for quite a while, and I've seen so many great grassroots projects. And these are just tools like any other, but let me give you a few examples that might excite you as activists and human rights activists. There's a group based in Oakland that everyone should support, Digital Democracy. Digital Democracy believes that tools are always better when you sit down at the table with those who are using them and they are owned by the people using them. So they're using the hypercore protocol, not a blockchain, to create something called Mapio. And Mapio helps people who are offline in the Amazon to map their territories. It's an asynchronous technology that allows you to share information. So you can imagine how you could create a map using that. And all the technology, the maps belong to the tribes themselves. I just dropped in there Compost Magazine. Compost Magazine is founded by Mai Ishikawa Sutton and Ben Lau. Mai was an EFFer before she was a DWebber. But this is, if you look at their guidelines and kind of the ethos that they've built this with, it's very co-op based. You can see this magazine on the World Wide Web, but you can also see it on IPFS and on Hypercore. And you see that little mushroom in the top when you click on it. It means that little micropayments are going to the creators. And in Mai's magazine, coders make the same as editors, make the same as writers. There's kind of a belief that all of our contributions should be valued equally. So these are just little examples of people taking the technology and using it to do cool new things based on the values that they're bringing to the technology. The values don't live in the technology. You have to bring them to the technology, and it's still wide open. We can do this. We can infuse our values and write it into the code.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say, I agree with Leah. It's very fascinating, but I also agree with John that sometimes it just feels like glorified crowdfunding or glorified sort of community organizing. But I also think I think it's important to have a conversation with folks outside of the US as well on this, because I think there are a lot of sort of applications in other countries that we are just not, that a lot of us are reading about, but a lot of us here, and there's probably some folks outside of the US too, but a lot of us in the US are just not realizing the importance of further up the stack where whole websites are being taken down, or and having something that is, and the last thing I'll say is just uncensorable, permissionless money, I think also can play a critical role.
Great. I think that we have time to squeeze in one more really quickly. And of course, I'm going to ask a huge question. So I'm going to try to put two different issues in here. So with sex workers already facing deplatforming, like the OnlyFans incident from last year, in which all sex workers were going to be deplatformed despite their activities being legal, because Christian right organizations wanted to take pressured payment companies to financially deplatform them, to abortion rights being poised to fail in the US. It seems like privacy and financial rights are poised to take a big hit here. And so I wanted to ask if anybody has specific thoughts about these threats and the fact that we may be on the cusp of an internet that is less open and less supportive of the rights of many people who are traditionally marginalized, and how might we address the optimism that comes with these technologies and balance it with the desperate need for a better world.
I think they may be missing the point a little bit, that decentralized technologies are built to help and prevent the deplatforming of sex workers and other groups, because they can be end-to-end encrypted, right? Who are you going to go to? You can't go to Twitter or Facebook and say, hey, get rid of those folks. It's decentralized in its authority. That's one of the great things about it. But in an end-to-end, totally private, encrypted world, when bad actors, you name them, child pornographers, whatever you want, get on, also there is no central authority to deplatform them. Content moderation is the #1 problem in the decentralized web. When you solve one thing around privacy and control, you create a whole new set of problems. And among the circles that I run in, that is the question that everyone is really worried about.
John?
Yeah, I'll jump in again as the person who's built some of these things as well, who knows that you build end-to-end encryption and it's really useful. I mean, it's something I've spent a fair fraction of my life on. I think it's important, I think it's powerful, but it isn't the whole solution. I mean, for example, the problem that we have with deplatforming sex workers and others is not going to be solved with technology. We need to directly address the fact that we shouldn't be deplatforming this, that we need to be saying that sex work is work. We need to be saying that these things are valuable and that freedom is not doing what you want. Freedom is defending people that you disagree with. That if we don't have these societal agreements about a lot of things, we're not going to undo that disagreement with a cool technological tool. So while they're incredibly useful, it's not the answer.
And on that note, that technology is a tool and is not in and of itself the answer. A tremendous thank you to everyone. First and foremost, to our excellent panelists. I certainly have learned a tremendous amount, and I'm really looking forward to continuing the conversation. And a huge thanks to Leah for being and to Fight for the Future as a whole, for being really the driving force behind this, and to our attendees for engaging and asking such amazing questions. As we mentioned at the beginning, we will be doing these as a monthly webinar exploring different aspects of Web3 and the Metaverse. And so please keep your eyes open for information about the next one. And if anyone has any questions, I will put my email in the chat and feel free to reach out. Leah, any final words?
I would just respond to, a lot of folks are asking if there's going to be a follow-up with resources in this video. We did have all the panelists agree that this could be posted publicly, so right before this. So we'll definitely be putting this video up. Stay tuned for more information on the next event, and we'll pull that together by the seat of our pants, or less so than this time.
We'll make sure to reach out to everyone who registered today.
Yeah, totally. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone.